So what I'm going to talk about today is really about looking at the regulatory system that's in place using the Great Barrier Reef as our case study. We're currently working on the Reef Restoration and Adaptation Programme, and I'm the co-lead on the regulatory sub-team. So effectively, we're tasked with the issue of looking at the regulatory landscape for the interventions, not at the present time, but as we're looking into the future. So we're looking for those large scale-up issues. We're looking at things like assisted gene flow or cloud brightening, so things that haven't been done before, and how can the regulatory space work. But I want to kind of point out a few issues, if you like, and a bit of history first. So we sit in the cross-cutting program within RRAP as amongst the regulatory frameworks, and that also works with our colleagues who work with stakeholders, work with traditional owners, there's a team called the biocultural team, and within the RRAP program, you'll have seen this before, probably from David, these are all cross-cutting, so we work with all the scientists throughout the different processes. And one of the things that we're tasked with is looking at the regulatory space from different perspectives. So a little bit of a pause to give you a potted history here of the barrier reef and regulation. So the Great Barrier Reef is the key legislation, if you like, and there is a colleague from Great Barrier Reef Marine Park in the room, so she'll correct me if I'm wrong. But effectively, when the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Act began, which gave the authority and formed the authority to regulate and manage the reef, that was back in 1975. Lots of politics that led to that, but effectively it was a very technocratic approach. So it was didn't include people, didn't really look at regulation. It was pure science-based, pure ecologically based. All decisions were made on that. And this technocratic governance, if you like, model ran until 1998. When then there was an awareness around the early impacts we were seeing of climate change. There were some earlier episodes of bleaching, and there's a shift over to adaptive governance. Now, adaptive governance brings in your social, more of your kind of engagement with the community, citizen science, those kind of components. And so we've had that adaptive governance model until now, but times are changing, and one of my arguments personally is that there's an opportunity here to change the governance again, and one could be polycentric governance, so I'll get to that in a little while. But it's really about having a paradigm shift. So if we look at adaptive governance is the sort of, what happened with that, we got the zoning in the Great Barrier Reef, and this was in 2004. And so that included a process where you were talking to communities, you were talking to stakeholders, you were talking to businesses, ecosystem services, social ecosystem services, so tourism industries. And that combined with the sort of, that created the zoning area, which then fitted into the reef regulatory landscape, which is also very complicated because we know so one of the reasons it's complicated is that, like America, Australia is a federal government system. So effectively we have state and we have federal, so we have local and national. And that creates not problems, but it makes it more complicated. So this is a nice version of this diagram of how the legislative landscape looks. I'm going to show you what we like kindly refer to as the horrendogram in a minute, which is a bit more complicated. But effectively, this is, so anything up to the 3 nautical mile is actually the under the Queensland government's responsibility. And then after that, it goes up to the 12 nautical mile and it becomes the federal. And that's been in position since the, what we know as the Emerald Agreement, but since the Act, basically. The Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority also have authority, literally, up to 915 meters in the sky. So drones, for example, would come into that. But in the example of, say, cloud brightening with RRAP, we need to also keep that in mind, because clouds can be high and low. But also, if it goes beyond that, then we're looking at things like the Civil Aviation Safety Authority. So regulatory-wise, it's not just within the reef, it's also those bigger kind of areas, for example. It also goes down a very long way as well, which is 1,000 meters beneath the seabed. But what it means is this jurisdiction, there is a process in place where it's a joint field reef management system, but it makes it quite complicated. And when this was formed, the reason that they've got the joint reef management system, or one of the earlier rationales, was because at the time the Queensland government, under a guy called Jobbjörki Peterson, which is not easy to say, was not keen on having, in his mind, the reef was Queensland. It was very territorial. It was Queensland waters, and there was a lot of back channeling and politics going on to get to this stage. So effectively, this is what it looks like in a very nice infograph. We then mapped all the laws and regulations that we're having to deal with RRAP when we're looking at this, and this is where you get the horrendogram. So this is, it's published, and this is all the kind of laws that need to be considered and legislation, not for everything, you know, you're only looking sometimes at certain areas and other times you're looking at overall. And since we've had the adaptive governance, and I'm talking about polycentric, a lot of things now are around the Reef 2050 plan. The Reef 2050 plan was a response to the UNESCO, in part, between the Queensland and the federal government, over what they were going to do to prevent the reef from being put in danger. So if we all remembered hearing the stories of the Great Barrier Reef going on the in danger list, this is the plan which is to Reef 2050, so that's when it's being implemented. And it's to address things like control or maintenance, if you like, of coastal development. So why I'm showing you all this is, and you can see that with the diagram there, and then we also have lots of other things to consider. So for example, sorry, I'll just go back. I can't go back. You'll have seen very briefly on there the Gene Technology Act. So if we are looking at that kind of intervention science, then we need to include the Gene Technology, Office of the Gene Technology. We have had early conversations with them, and they have never done anything in the marine space, so any knowledge, like a lot of legislation, is being brought out and drawn on from terrestrial. But as we also know, terrestrial's not quite the same as the marine space, so there's another kind of issue that we're looking at. This, as I say, is the Reef 2050 focus, so climate change is obviously a key issue, and addressing local and regional pressures such as coastal development. In Queensland, up until a few years ago, mining was a massive issue, particularly a mine called the Adani mine, which is owned by an Indian company. That became a very contentious issue, and it became a symbol of sort of the problems with the reef and bleaching, and it became very, very politicized. And the reef space has always been politicized, but this really kind of heightened it. Again, land-based runoff water quality is a big issue, so regulating for that, and coastal development as well. So this is the landscape in which we're working with Reef Restoration Adaptation. And we're also looking, you know, and this is the people doing on the ground the work. They're also looking at all those horrendograms, and if you look at them, a problem with that is a lot of the legislation is outdated. Now, that is nothing, I'm not criticizing the authority in any way, you know, they have enough to deal with in the present day, but it does mean that one of our problems is that policy is really quite outdated. So even if you look at the top one there, translocation policy, well, it's now actually, I've heard, a guideline. It's no longer a policy, but 2007, we're now in 2022. So one of the issues here is kind of looking at hand translocation, which is an act from, as I say, 2007. And you've also, more recently, there is the policy on Great Barrier Reef interventions, and in the proof of concept phase of RRAP, we actually were asked to put some feedback into that. So that was a really nice relationship between the authority. Obviously, they could completely ignore us, but we were invited, and the scientists from RRAP as well were invited to just give some kind of reviews and what we thought of it. And then there's an ongoing conversation around the Environmental Sea Dumping Act, which is your artificial reefs, and whether it still applies. Again, look at that date, 1981. So these are not just issues that we're dealing with, but the regulators are also having to deal with. So I guess the point of my presentation is, like Facebook, it's complicated. Very much so in the Great Barrier Reef. And then the other thing as well is, as I say, just highlighting those dates. And I know that some people want to get rid of the Sea Dumping Act altogether, but like everything, it takes some time. So, how am I going on time? Good. So what does this look like if we expand it? This is a diagram that's somehow not worked, but these are kind of, as you all know, images that they were supposed to be images that show you where there is coral reef in the world. So one of the things that we're doing here at Reef Futures is we're holding a forum tomorrow with a lot of regulators and decision makers. And because what we've seen as well is in some of the early studies, you know, and other studies, that this issue around state and federal is going to be with them as well. So if you look at, for example, the, where are we here? Where are we? Puerto Rico, thank you. Poor Puerto Rico, of course, got impacted by Hurricane Ian recently. But it's just a very, I'm going to zip through these. You can see jurisdictional waters, you've got federal, and then you've got, you know, state level. Same as well. We can look at the United States Virgin Islands. I know Matt's in the room, who's from there and coming to the forum. So again, you've got these two different laws. And actually, we did a pre-forum survey, which will show the results after the forum. But one of the comments was, can there be some recognition of the US federal regulatory system working much closer with the US Pacific Island system? So even internally within America, if you like, there are hurdles there and issues to overcome, just to add to the complexity even more. Again, Hawaii looks quite simple, but just a very simple, and American Samoa as well. So you get the point that it is, you know, it's that challenge between the federal system and the state system. And again, in the survey results that we've done from the forum, majority of the laws and legislation that people are working to are actually local based. So they're local fisheries acts, or they're local, not necessarily restoration, because there's a gap there. There's not a lot. You know, the stuff that Garumpa are doing, that restoration policy, is actually quite unique to have it in writing and in a policy process. So that's some work that we're going to be doing on and building on from the forum and as we go forward. This may be out of date and telling a room full of people from America what their Congress and legislation is. Nothing personal. I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you. But there is signs of hope. Obviously, there is the Ocean-Based Climate Solutions Act and the Restoring Resilient Reefs Act. And Jen, I'm sure you will probably know more about this, and could give people an update if they want to, including myself. Yeah, but my understanding is it's going quite slowly through the Senate and through the House. It's taking a while. Oh. Great. Yay. Right. Well, that's the important thing. And again, you know, it's that little piece of the jigsaw, or the way the cake, you know, it comes in. And yeah, it's an issue that's definitely got to be addressed. So kind of that wraps it up, really. So the next thing is we have the forum, which we're doing tomorrow. And we've done this survey. We will publish the findings, as long as everyone from the forum are happy. The idea is to, you know, let's see what people want, but we know also that risk is a big issue, and the appetite for risk is always going to be a bit of a hurdle when it comes to regulating restoration, because you're regulating for the unknown. But sometimes, as David said in his presentation, the do-nothing option is no longer an option. And so it's just a question here of, you know, us working with the regulators and kind of recognizing within that very adaptive governance and other forms of systems, and I know Nikki's going to talk about other ways it can do it, it's time for a paradigm change, and I think increasingly we're hearing that from around the world. So that's my time up, and thank you.